I want you to imagine a scenario for a second. Um, think about your own life, your family, your current financial safety net. What is the one thing that keeps you up at night when you think about your finances?
Right. Mostly we're conditioned to look for those big, obvious threats.
Exactly. Like we worry about a sudden stock market crash wiping out our retirement or a global recession or, your company
Or a
downsizing.
sudden medical emergence.
Yeah, exactly. But what if the greatest threat to your family's financial survival wasn't any of those things?
It's a genuinely unsettling thought.
It really is. What if the thing that permanently bankrupts your family, that literally steals your children's future, is actually a sacred, untouchable tradition? Like something that society absolutely sources you to participate in, with a smile on your face.
I mean, we just don't look for danger in the things we've been taught to revere. We assume traditions are inherently protective, We
Right.
rarely look for financial ruin in the cultural rituals that we and our parents and our grandparents have been practicing our entire lives.
And that is exactly the mission of today's deep dive. We are heading into a specific corner of the world, a region in South Africa called Agincourt.
Guided by a truly phenomenal economic study from the National Bureau of Economic Research.
Yeah, put together by two economists,
Mm.
Ann Case from Princeton and Alicia Menendez from the University of Chicago. And I have to tell you, when I was reading through the sources for this, I had to stop and reread paragraphs just to make sure I wasn't misunderstanding the numbers.
The data is shocking.
It is that shocking.
Oh, yeah.
So we are going to unpack how a simple, everyday ritual, when it collides with a sudden shift in history, just completely mutates.
Right. It turns into a wealth-destroying black hole. And I want to stress right from the start, while our data comes from South Africa, this isn't just a story about one region.
No, not at all.
It's a masterclass in uncovering the hidden, terrifying ways that outdated social norms silently harvest the wealth of the middle class and the poor. Everywhere.
Let's start by painting a picture of where we are. So we are looking at data from the Agincourt Demographic Surveillance Site.
It's a rural sub-district.
Yeah. Home to both South African families and Mozambican families who settled there during the Civil War in Mozambique. And it is so important to understand the economic baseline here. We are talking about a region that is poor, but, it's functioning.
People are surviving.
Right. The average household here manages on a total monthly expenditure about 782 South African rand.
And to give that number some context, 782 Rand was roughly equal to the state old age pension at the time of the study.
Okay, so these families are carefully managing their daily survival. They are putting food on the table, paying for basic school fees, keeping the lights on.
Exactly. They have a system that works, but there is virtually zero margin for error. Like every single Rand has a job to do.
And then tragedy strikes. Someone in the family dies. Now, you would think the primary devastation here is purely emotional,
Yeah.
but the financial tsunami that follows is what economists look at and just gasp.
Because the thing destroying these families isn't an economic recession, it's the funeral. The financial reality of these funerals defies all basic economic logic. An average adult funeral in this region costs 3,400 Rand.
Wow. I really want you, listening to this, to hold those two numbers in your head.
It's staggering.
The entire household spends 782 Rand a month to survive, but the funeral costs 3,400 Rand.
That represents 40% of an average household's total annual expenditure.
Boy, piss.
40% of everything a family spends in an entire year just evaporated in a matter of days.
Let's translate that to a middle-class income just to feel the weight of it. If your household takes home, say, $50,000 a year to cover your mortgage, your groceries, your kids' braces,
Right?
this is like society forcing you to throw a $20,000 party the exact week your primary breadwinner dies.
You wouldn't just be in debt, you would be completely broken.
How on earth does a culture develop a tradition so perfectly designed to bankrupt its own people?
That is the core puzzle the researchers set out to solve. Because, human beings are generally rational. We tend to assume that if an ancient custom has survived for generations, it must serve some positive, adaptive function for the community.
We think of traditions as accumulated wisdom.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But there's a catch. When the course of history suddenly changes and the environment shifts, an old custom can become a lethal liability.
Because it wasn't always a liability, right? Like the tradition of the lavish funeral didn't historically cause this kind of mass bankruptcy.
No, it didn't. Historically, expensive funerals were actually perfectly sustainable in this region. They did not cause economic ruin. And the reason comes down entirely to demographics.
Who was actually dying?
Right. In the past, people mostly died at the extreme ends of the age spectrum. They died either very young, as infants, or very old.
And when an infant dies, I mean, obviously it's an unspeakable emotional tragedy for the parents, but purely from a cold economic standpoint, it's not the loss of a breadwinner.
The household's income stream remains intact.
Yeah. And when an older person dies, the economic shock is also buffered, isn't it?
Much more buffered. Older people usually had pensions. More importantly, they almost always had funeral insurance. The elderly had decades to prepare.
So when a grandfather passed away, his insurance basically covered the lavish funeral.
Exactly. And the working adults, the 30-year-olds who were the economic pillars of the family, they just kept working. The financial ecosystem of the household remained stable.
But then the environment changed. So the tradition of the lavish funeral isn't the villain all by itself. The villain is the timeline.
The mortality age structure in southern Africa underwent a radical, terrifying alteration.
The AIDS epidemic.
It completely flipped the script on who was dying in these communities. Suddenly, the people passing away weren't just the infants and the elderly. The mortality rate spiked highest for adults aged 20 to 34 years old.
Oh, wow. The absolute prime economic pillars of the household, the people actually bring in the paychecks.
Precisely. And this is what we call a fatal historical dislocation. The social rule demanding a massive, expensive funeral did not adapt to this new reality.
The cultural expectation to feed hundreds of mourners, to buy the expensive coffin, it all stayed exactly the same.
But the financial burden came crashing down on the exact families who had just lost their main source of income. And because these victims were only in their 20s or 30s, they didn't have the decades of savings or the insurance policies that the elderly had.
It's like a bridge that was built to carry horse-drawn carriages suddenly being forced to carry 18-wheeler trucks, but nobody is allowed to acknowledge that the bridge is collapsing.
That's a great analogy.
So to uncover this invisible wealth black hole, these economists didn't just sit in an office in the Ivy League and run theoretical models. They had to get on the ground.
Yeah, the methodology of this study is what makes it so undeniable. In 2004, Case and Menendez executed a highly controlled operation. They didn't rely on, vague anecdotes about funerals being expensive.
They wanted the raw data.
They sampled 473 households, encompassing almost 3,000 individuals in the Agincourt region.
I was reading about how they structured this, and it's brilliant. They didn't just ask random people. They strictly divided their sample.
They looked at South African families versus Mozambican families.
And crucially, they separated households that had experienced a recent death from those that hadn't, creating this perfect comparison group.
The timing of their interviews was also a masterstroke of research design. They specifically sought out households where a death had occurred between June 2002 and May 2003.
Why that specific window?
Because they needed the sweet spot of memory. If they interviewed a family the week after a death, they would be intruding on raw, immediate grief, and the final bills might not even be settled yet.
Right, that makes sense.
But if they waited 5 years, human memory fades. People forget exactly how much they spent on groceries versus transportation. By targeting that specific 1 to 2 year window, they reached households where the exact financial ledger of the funeral was still painfully fresh in their minds.
They needed those receipts because, we have this romanticized view of funerals. We assume they are about comforting the dead, honoring a life, providing closure.
But when you look at the actual itemized bills these researchers collected, it completely strips away the romance.
It really does. It looks like a brutal, systematic robbery of the living. Let's dig into the buried wealth inventory. Where is this 300-400 Rand actually going?
The itemized breakdown is incredibly revealing, and it highlights the social pressure at play. The largest outlays fall into 3 categories.
Okay.
The coffin, the meat for the meal following the funeral, and general groceries. Unsurprisingly, 65% of these families purchase a coffin, and they spend an average of 2,200 Rand on it.
Okay, the coffin makes sense. Even if it's wildly expensive relative to their income, a casket is the universal symbol of a funeral. But it's the next line item that completely stopped me in my tracks when I read the paper.
The meats.
The meat.
85% of households report buying meat for the funeral, spending an average of 1,100 Rand. And they spend an additional 700 Rand on other groceries.
1,100 Rand on meat. Let's just pause there for a second.
Oh.
If their entire household budget for the month, for electricity, rent, their own food, School fees. If that is under 800 Rand,
Right.
you are telling me they spend more than a month's salary, half the cost of a high-end casket, just on beef and chicken.
It sounds entirely irrational until you understand the mechanics of social coercion. Mourners come from all over the region to pay their respects, and the rigid social expectation is that if they show up, they must be fed, and they must be fed well.
Meat is a high-status item.
Exactly. Some of these mourners travel long distances and stay with the mourning household for several days. The funeral essentially becomes a massive multi-day catering event.
But surely, if you are a poor family, your neighbors know you are poor. Can't you just say, "Thank you for coming, we appreciate your condolences, but we literally cannot afford to feed you roast beef. Let's just do a quiet graveside service."
You would think so, but the data shows that opting out is not permitted. The inescapability of this tradition is terrifying.
They literally can't say no.
The researchers found that even the poorer Mozambican households, who objectively have far fewer assets and lower baseline incomes, they're still forced to spend an average of 1,629 Rand.
Wow.
Yes, the wealthier South African households spend more, around 3,700 Rand, but the floor is incredibly high. No one is allowed to just opt out. The social drain is mandatory.
It's a regressive tax. It charges a massive flat fee just to maintain your basic social standing in the community, totally regardless of your ability to pay. And it leads to one of the most chilling data points in the entire paper. I really want to focus on this because it shows how completely detached this tradition is from any kind of economic logic.
The age threshold.
Yeah, the 5-year-old dividing line.
If we want to understand how rigid and blind social norms can be, this is the perfect example. The cost of a funeral in this region has absolutely zero correlation with an individual's actual economic value to the family. It depends entirely on one binary factor, whether the deceased has crossed their 5th birthday.
So if a baby or a toddler, ages 0 to 5, passes away.
But the funeral is relatively modest. The average cost for a child under 5 is 682 Rand. Still a heavy burden for these families, but it doesn't trigger complete financial collapse.
But the absolute second that child turns 6.
Their funeral costs skyrocket to an average of 3,415 Rand.
That is the exact same staggering cost as burying a 60-year-old adult.
Think about the pure horror of that social rule. A family loses a 6-year-old child. From a purely financial perspective, that child brings in zero income. In fact, they cost money to raise.
Yeah, they are dependent.
The family is experiencing an unimaginable emotional devastation. And right in the middle of that trauma, society hits them with the exact same financially catastrophic 3,400 Rand bill as a family burying a grown adult who had a pension.
That is insane.
The data is clear. Once you pass age 5, there is absolutely no relationship between your age and how much your funeral costs.
So a 6-year-old and a 6-year-old cost the exact same to bury. It's mechanical. It's a blind social tax. But, I can hear people listening to this and thinking, okay, but human gains aren't monsters. It takes a village, right?
Right, the community myth.
Yeah, and these massive mourning ceremonies where hundreds of people show up to eat the meat, surely the whole village is passing the hat. Surely the community is chipping in to help the family cover these insane costs.
That is the grand illusion of community. We have this deep psychological need to believe that communities absorb the pain of their members. But the data from Agincourt ruthlessly dismantles that comforting myth.
So when the bill for the coffin and the catering comes due, who is actually paying for this prestige?
The crushing weight of the bill falls almost entirely on the most fragile shoulders in the room, the immediate grieving family.
The poor family.
In 81% of funerals, the core family members are forced to go out of pocket, coughing up an average of almost 2,500 Rand themselves.
But what about the extended family? Aunts, uncles, cousins? Or the local church? Don't they step in?
They do show up, and they do contribute, but it's a fraction of what's needed. Extended family contributes in about 73% of funerals, but they give a much smaller amount, about 1,358 Rand on average.
Okay, what about the wider community?
They chip in maybe 340 Rand.
Wait, 340 Rand?
Yeah, and the church, which you might expect to be a major safety net, contributes to about half the funerals, but only gives an average of 282 Rand.
So let me get this straight. The community shows up to eat 1,100 Rands worth of meat, but they only chip in 340 Rands to help pay for it.
Exactly.
The grieving family is effectively subsidizing a feast for their neighbors, and they are left holding the bag for the coffin, the groceries, and the massive debt. What about employers? Surely if a 30-year-old breadwinner dies, a good employer helps out the widow.
Employers are a fascinating footnote in the data. They only help out 12% of the time.
That's nothing.
Now, when they do help, they give generously, nearly 2,900 Rand. But 9 times out of 10, the employer is entirely absent from the financial equation. The core family is alone.
So we have a family making 780 Rand a month, suddenly forced to pay 2,500 Rand out of pocket in a matter of days. What happens next? Because the funeral eventually ends. The guests go home, the meat is eaten, the prayers are said. What does the day after the funeral look like?
That is when the true suffering of the living actually begins. Economists refer to this as the secondary disaster.
A secondary disaster.
And it is vital to understand that this isn't just a tough month where you tighten your belt, skip a few luxuries, and bounce back. This is a structural collapse. The family plunges into a poverty spiral.
The researchers actually tracked the daily survival ledgers of these households over time, Ray. What did they find when they compared families who had a funeral to families who didn't?
They measured the daily per capita spending of these households, literally how much money is spent per person per day on basic survival.
Okay.
They found that families who lost a member over age 6 experience a 20% permanent drop in their daily per capita spending compared to their neighbors who didn't have a death in the family.
20% permanent drop. And remember, we aren't talking about a rich family cutting back on vacation.
Exactly. When your baseline is 782 Rand a month, a 20% drop cuts straight into bone. It means you stop buying protein. You delay fixing the leaking roof. You stop buying medicine.
It's devastating.
The funeral completely drains all liquid cash and usually forces the family to take on high-interest debt from local moneylenders. They don't bounce back after a year or two. They simply learn to survive on significantly less food and fewer basic necessities.
And this leads to what I genuinely believe is the most heartbreaking part of the entire deep dive, the sacrificed future.
Yes.
The adults in the community are playing this high-stakes game of social status with the funeral. They're terrified of looking cheap in front of their neighbors. But the people actually paying the bill, the ones who suffer the most, are the ones who have absolutely no voice in the process.
The children. The economic shockwave of the funeral instantly infects the next generation. Case and Menendez didn't just look at grocery bills, they measured human capital. They tracked the school enrollment rates for surviving kids and young adults, ages 5 to 25.
And this is where the data just feels like a punch to the gut. If a family member over age 6 dies, the school enrollment rate for the surviving kids instantly drops by a massive 4 percentage points.
The economists went even further to prove the exact mechanism. They isolated the mathematical ratio between the money spent on the funeral and the likelihood of a child staying in school.
What was the ratio?
They found that for every 1,000 Rand dumped into a funeral, a child's chance of staying in school drops by 3 percentage points.
Wait, I want to make sure I'm understanding that correctly. It's a direct trade-off.
Direct.
Every time they upgrade the coffin or buy more meat to impress the neighbors, a child's chance of getting an education mathematically vanishes.
Yes. To bury the past, they are literally burying their own future. The money that should have paid for a textbook or school shoes or a mandatory uniform is quite literally going into the dirt.
It's a chilling equation, and it completely destroys the idea that this is just a harmless cultural quirk. Education is the single most reliable engine for upward mobility in any developing economy.
Absolutely.
By forcing families to divert their scarce education funds into funeral expenses, the social norm is ensuring that poverty is permanently passed down to the next generation.
It becomes an engine of generational poverty. And the toll isn't just financial or educational. It takes a massive psychological toll on the surviving adults.
Like the mental health aspect. We usually think of grief as just a natural human emotion. You lose someone you love, you feel sad. But under these twisted social rules, your mental breakdown has a literal, exact price tag attached to it.
This section of the study is revolutionary because it bridges economics and psychology. The researchers didn't just ask about money. They measured the mental health of the adults using the CESD scale.
Which is a standard test.
It is a standard psychological tool used worldwide. They asked the adults questions like, do you feel miserable? Are you crying a lot? Are you experiencing restless sleep? Have you lost your appetite?
And, unsurprisingly, they found that when a death occurs, the family's depression index spikes. It goes up by an average of 0.262 points. That makes total sense. Someone died.
But then the economists did something brilliant with the data, and this is the twist that completely changes how you view this whole situation.
Oh, this part blew my mind.
What's fascinating here is what happens when the economists ran the numbers and controlled for the actual money spent to pay for the funeral. Basically, they used statistical tools to strip away the financial debt from the equation to see how much of the depression was caused purely by the grief of losing a loved one.
And what did they find?
When they factored out the financial cost up to expenditures of 7,200 Rand, the association between the death itself and the adult's anxiety and depression almost completely vanished.
Wait, I need to make sure I am grasping this because it sounds impossible. The data says that the emotional collapse, the sleepless nights, the crying, it isn't primarily driven by the grief of the death itself. It's driven by the debt.
Yes, the mental health crisis is inextricably tied to the financial crisis. The researchers explicitly state that adults reporting symptoms of depression and anxiety following a death can be explained by the household's financial contribution to the funeral.
That is horrifying.
The more money they're forced to spend, the faster their sanity collapses. It's the terror of waking up at 3 a.m. and not knowing how you will feed your surviving children because you had to borrow money to buy a 2,200 Rand coffin to satisfy the neighbors.
Society is essentially charging them money to lose their minds. The grief is just the starting point. The real trauma is the inescapable financial ruin. And when that financial dam breaks inside the mind of the adults, the stress tears the whole house apart, doesn't it?
It leads to ubiquitous derivative crises. When a family is subjected to this kind of extreme artificial financial shock, the entire social ecosystem of the home fractures.
It's a domino effect of ruin. The data shows that families hit with these adult deaths reported massive spikes in secondary crises. They saw a 5 percentage point increase in severe food shortages.
Right.
A 5 percentage point increase in vicious quarrels inside the home. And intense anxiety about neighborhood safety.
And once again, the researchers proved this isn't just people acting out because they are sad. When they adjust the models to control for the drop in per capita spending, when they isolate the poverty effect, these social problems disappear from the data.
So the grief didn't cause the family to tear itself apart fighting over the dinner table. The poverty caused by the funeral caused the fighting.
Yes.
Lack of food causes the fighting. It's hunger and desperation manifesting as domestic conflict.
Which naturally raises an incredibly important question. If this system is so obviously destructive, if it leads to starvation and depression and kids dropping out of school, why don't they protect themselves?
Because it's not like the concept of insurance is unknown in South Africa. This leads us into the abyss of the insurance paradox.
Exactly. A financial tool exists specifically to protect you from this exact type of ruin. South Africa actually has a robust funeral insurance and burial society system.
So why are young families lining up to go bankrupt instead of just buying the insurance?
It's a classic behavioral economics trap, and the data reveals a very stark divide. 70% of older people, the pensioners, have funeral insurance, but only 27% of younger working-age people have it.
That is a massive gap. And it's not out of ignorance, right? Like, the younger generation knows the AIDS epidemic is happening. They are watching their peers die. They know a funeral costs 3,400 Rand. So why do only a quarter of them buy the policy?
It comes down to something the paper calls the short-sightedness trap. To explain this, the authors reference a brilliant analogy by economist Carla Hoff regarding farmers and fertilizer.
Okay, how does that work?
It's a well-known phenomenon in development economics. Farmers often will not buy fertilizer when they actually need it at the start of the planting season because cash is tight and the payoff is months away. But they will happily buy it immediately after a harvest when they have cash in hand, even though they have to store it for an entire year.
Okay, I see the human nature in that. We like doing things when we feel flush with cash. But how does the fertilizer analogy apply to buying funeral insurance?
Pensioners buy funeral insurance at a rate of 70% because the insurance sellers understand this behavioral quirk. They literally set up their booths at the gates where the pensioners pick up their monthly cash payouts.
Oh.
The pensioner has cash in hand, the seller is right in front of them, the transaction is frictionless, so they buy the policy.
Ah, they don't have to plan. The solution is handed to them at the exact moment they have liquidity.
Mm-hmm.
But the younger people,
The younger, non-pension demographic has to actively seek out the insurance. And psychologically, humans completely refuse to plan for their own tragic early demise.
it's too grim.
It is simply too psychologically painful for a healthy 25-year-old to sit down, look at their tight budget, and decide to pay 30 Rand a month to plan for their own death. It requires them to accept their own mortality in the prime of their life. So they ignore it. They put it off. They think, I'll deal with that later. until it is too late.
It's a completely understandable psychological defense mechanism. Nobody wants to think about dying young. But in this specific cultural context, where the social penalty for a cheap funeral is absolute, that psychological avoidance becomes a literal death sentence for their family's finances.
It really does.
Now, I know what a skeptic listening to this might be thinking, because whenever we talk about poverty, people look for ways to blame the victim. Someone is inevitably going to ask, were these families just already poor? Maybe they were destined to fail, they made bad choices, and the funeral is just a convenient excuse for why they couldn't keep their kids in school.
It's a valid scientific question. Are they inherently poor, or are they poor because of the death? The economists anticipated this skepticism, so they explicitly demined the data. This is where the sheer academic rigor of Case and Menendez really shines.
They didn't leave room for alternative explanations.
Oh, they didn't.
So how did they prove it wasn't just pre-existing poverty?
They meticulously tested the baseline socioeconomic status of these households before the death occurred. They looked at the parallel universes of these families. They measured the number of physical assets the household owned. They looked at the highest level of education achieved by any member in the family.
They checked their housing too, right?
Yes, they looked at the quality of their housing, whether they had access to a proper toilet or lived in a formal dwelling versus a shack.
And what did they find when they compared the families who eventually had a death to the families who didn't?
The undeniable fact is that before the death, these families were statistically identical to their neighbors. There was absolutely no pre-existing weakness. None. They had the same number of assets, the same educational achievements, the same housing conditions.
That is the smoking gun. It's undeniable proof. The death, and specifically the absurdly expensive funeral tradition, is the sole trigger that forces a functioning middle-class family to permanently slide down the social ladder.
Exactly.
It's not a lifetime of bad financial planning. It's not laziness. It's a one-week social event that completely detonates a lifetime of work.
Which brings us to the most frustrating part of this entire dynamic: the shackles of vanity and the silence of the system. When a single individual faces the collective gaze and pressure of an entire society, human rationality is completely defenseless.
People always try to rationalize these traditions. I've heard people say, well, maybe big funerals are just reserved to honor really important people in the community. If the mayor or a wealthy businessman dies, it's a big party. If a regular guy dies, it's small.
The data ruthlessly debunks the myth of status. The researchers checked to see if funeral spending correlated with the deceased person's status. For anyone over the age of 5, the cost of the funeral has virtually zero correlation with their age, whether they were the head of the household or how much money they used to make when they were healthy.
It doesn't matter if you were the primary breadwinner who built the town or a 6-year-old kid who just learned to read. The bill is exactly the same.
It is a blind, mechanical, coercive social norm.
And the tragedy is, the institutions in South Africa know this is happening. This isn't a secret. The South African Council of Churches has constantly begged communities to hold affordable funerals.
They put out reports, they make impassioned pleas from the pulpit, telling people that God doesn't require them to buy a 2,200 Rand coffin.
But the institutions are powerless. Why?
Because in the face of deep-rooted community pressure, the fear of judgment from your immediate neighbors is infinitely stronger than the advice of the church.
The fear of gossip.
The fear of being gossiped about, of being seen as someone who didn't respect their mother or their child, overrides all logic. People will literally go bankrupt, starve themselves, and pull their kids out of school rather than face the shame of holding a cheap funeral.
If we pull the lens back, this is where we hit the most terrifying realization of this entire deep dive: the hidden social exploitation. On the surface, we spent the last hour talking about one specific demographic surveillance site in South Africa. But beneath the surface, this NBER paper reveals the hidden meat grinder logic of how the world really works.
Exactly. Extrapolating this core mechanism is crucial. This paper isn't just about funerals in Agincourt. It is a blueprint for understanding what happens when social norms and traditions fail to adapt to a changing modern reality. When traditions don't evolve, they mutate.
They transform into legal, invisible wealth harvesters. A tradition that was originally meant to bind a community together, to show solidarity, it just becomes a mechanism that actively strips the community of its resources.
Think about how a regressive tax works. It takes a larger percentage of income from low-income earners than from high-income earners. This social norm acts exactly like a highly targeted regressive tax.
Right.
It precisely strips wealth from the most vulnerable people at the exact moment they are too emotionally weak to fight back.
Because when you are grieving the sudden loss of your spouse or your child, you aren't going to have the energy to negotiate the price of a coffin.
No, you're not.
You aren't going to stand up to your extended family and tell them they can't have meat at the reception. You just sign the paper, take on the exorbitant debt, and in doing so, you cut off any chance you or your kids have of upward mobility.
This blueprint of invisible exploitation is everywhere once you know how to look for it.
It really is.
Look at the staggering cost of modern weddings in Western cultures. The social expectation to have a massive, Instagram-worthy event puts young couples into massive debt before they even buy a house or start a life together.
Or the tradition of the diamond engagement ring, which was literally a marketing invention that became a coercive social norm, dictating that a man must spend 2 months' salary to prove his love.
Or look at the expectation to buy a single-family home that no longer fits the economic reality of the middle class. Or the social pressure to take on hundreds of thousands of dollars in student loans for a prestige university when the economic payoff is no longer guaranteed.
The mechanism is exactly the same as the funerals in Agincourt. Social coercion driving financial ruin.
The packaging changes, but the engine is identical. It is a societal pressure that forces individuals to sacrifice their long-term financial security to satisfy the immediate, superficial judgment of their peers.
Which leaves us with a truly haunting thought about history repeating itself. We often say the only thing humans learn from history is that we absolutely refuse to learn from history.
Unadaptable customs destroy savings, they rob children of their education, they literally fund depression. We've seen the irrefutable data today. When a society refuses to update its rules to match its reality, it eats its own future.
And it is so incredibly easy for us to sit here, look at this study, look at the Agincourt region and think, wow, what a terrible, faraway problem. I can't believe they spend their money on meat instead of school books.
But we have to look closely at our own lives.
Exactly. Look at the expectations you feel pressured to meet right now, today.
Are we currently trapped in our own modern, unspeakably expensive rituals? Think about the milestone events, the social obligations, the immense pressure to maintain a certain lifestyle online. Are we clinging to expectations that made sense for our parents' generation but no longer fit our actual economic reality?
Are we mindlessly repeating this exact same cycle of self-destruction just to avoid the judgment of our neighbors? Just to make sure our metaphorical funeral looks good to the people eating our meat? It's a terrifying question. Take a hard look at the traditions in your own life and ask yourself, who is really paying the bill? Think about that, and we'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.